Schönen guten Tag, meine lieben Deutschlernenden. Good day, my dear learners of the German language. Welcome to this module, which is dedicated to common mistakes. At least this is how it is called. The very first question, what is actually common and what is a mistake? I'm not fooling you around. These are actually the first questions I asked myself when I started preparing this module, because it is not self-evident. It seems that it would be. Then, of course, how can them? And a very important question is, should we actually go 100%? I will tell you in a what I mean with that. Certain rules and also certain irregularities and certain specifics. And we are also going into this sort of aspects. And these aspects are leading to specific many of this language are doing. And of course, depending on what your native language is, also your spectrum of mistakes will be different. So if your native tongue is French, you will make certain things wrong in the beginning with a very, very high probability. If you are Chinese, then most likely you might make mistakes less, but you will have your Chinese sort of mistakes, and vice versa. This is actually very, very interesting, and it's a lot of fun to have students with different native language background, because you start understanding your own language a little bit better. So, what is a mistake? It is not that easy to answer. We have most European languages at the moment have been sort of standardized. It is like a corset, which is put around the waist, thinner. Grammatical rules, we have orthographic rules, we have the vocabulary, a lot of the way how we write, the vocab, which is called orthography, so spelling right. These mostly developed in the 19th century, and they are not, now they are set, but they are not really set, because after all, in any society, everything is negotiable. And this is also applicable to languages. So it is not necessary to speak 100% according to the book. This would actually even be a mistake, if you ask me, because it would limit the things you are actually capable to say. And what's more, German, what is German? If you go back 200 years, the beginning of the 19th century, when Napoleon came over Germany, it was not one single national state. It was actually 300 small principalities, and many of them having their own idioms. German is a very, very split culture, and actually Germany and German only developed quite recently into a language. It was a process of the last 500 years, but dialects are still very, very common, especially the further south you go. And we don't even talk about Austria and Switzerland, high up on 3,000 meters in the Alps. There, the dialects are actually necessarily not 100% stuck to kind of introduction or and many of the so-called mistakes actually frequently here. So some mistakes are okay and can do better. The bad news is German is a very logical, ordered by rules sort of language. So maybe 70%, I invented the numbers. It is just then maybe you have weird stuff, but you could actually apply. They're also good. So we are only left with 20%. So it needs time. You have to. The final question would be, should you go all the way, 100%? Whatever we learn in life, we should be 100% perfect. if you are 5% and you want 6, so basically the margin is extraordinarily high. So there must be some point where you energy step higher up the ladder. And maybe this is at 90%. And then you should. Okay. And so I'm only going to pinpoint at certain things which I, as a native, simply hear that it's done wrong, even though I don't really believe in right and wrong, but it's negotiations between people. Languages are, we try to better the way how you speak a little bit, at least what I will be lessons which are going to come. Very well then. I hope that you are good. Willkommen zurück. Welcome back. In our second lesson, which is still an introduction about the way how we learn languages, the way how we learn every aspect of life. So if there are actually two different ways to learn them. One could be to learn expressions by heart. The vocabulary, you learn a grammatical structure, and then you sort of have the skeleton, the vocabulary kind of, and there you go. Understand the rules behind it. German is rather structured, where you can use the second path. Easier on the street, just talking. Involved in that language. In the case of German, sticking to the rules. At least once you have this fundament, you can basically do whatever you want. Our brain has two major ways to memorize something. One is the short-term memory and the other one is the long-term memory. The short-term memory is basically kind of binge learning. So you learn a lot, it kind of sticks to your brain until you have the examinations, you pass the exam, and then you wait for 2 weeks. And if you were to write this exam again, you would actually fail because it's gone. Our school system is actually very, very much based on this principle, especially the examination principle. We kind of binge everything in, and I recommend not to do it because you actually want to learn German or whatever else in order to simply be stuck to your brain. And the long-term memory works mostly repetition. It is almost a hypnosis sort of thing. And as far as the ways of learning something is concerned, we have another two branches. One is conscious learning. So, and the other one is subconscious learning. Children actually, because when they are born, there were no teachers around them to tell them what exactly to do. They simply intuitively live. They use the information they have in their bodies, in their brains, and they simply, and they wake up in the morning years old, and they are more or less capable of talking to you without ever having an accent. And this is, as I would actually call it, it's magic. How when our background is basically the schools we are having in mind when we associate it with learning. People sitting there listening to a teacher, and then they think that they actually have learned something. And the conscious way to learn is basically the one we are using in our Western school system. Also in the Eastern school system in China, now I'm talking about system. Very, very smart. So they invented schools and they try to force young people and then students to forcefully, consciously learn something, because otherwise they would not call it learning. And as we know, it does not work. In the case of languages, you can actually hear it because you do not have so many people who speak a second language without an accent or flawlessly grammatically. And one of the reasons is because we actually try to force our conscious mind to actually go for it, which is a very, very small portion of the whole universe we actually live in. And since it doesn't really work, I also do not really recommend it doing. So I would rather recommend the subconscious part, because this is the much, much larger aspect of our being. It's a hypnosis sort of thing. You repeat, you repeat, you repeat, you reprogram the software you actually. And then even adults can actually learn languages quite quickly. It is more or less the reprogrammation, and it also works with languages. It actually works with anything we learn, any profession, any skill, any whatever. We simply have to expose ourselves to the environment, and then there is no given here when suddenly kind of speak the language. The reason I'm saying this is because I used to at university when I had week classes, university classes, by experienced and good teachers that being settled, progress. But then I went myself a bike and I cycled through China. 3 months, actually 80 days, a little bit less than 3 months. And there was this one evening when on the street somewhere in southern China, I was drinking, officially I'm saying 1 beer. Obviously, it was a little bit more, with a couple of Chinese people who were curious to see this Westerner there cycling around. And I realized that I did not use whatsoever because they did not speak any English. And then I realized, hey, bad accent, many grammatical mistakes, but you survive in Chinese. It was an amazing feeling. And it was not done at university. It was actually done on the street. Why? Because I was simply living through this language and not learning the language. I hope that you are good, and I'm very much looking Welcome back. Willkommen zurück. The family, certain rules which give you maybe 50, maybe 70% of accuracy when you do not know whether it is masculine, feminine, or neuter. Most of the rules are quite, so they can be logical, like there is something which is masculine or something which is feminine, like a man or a woman. It can be set by definition. For instance, all months are, or weekdays, masculine in find this out very, very easily. You look at the ending of the noun. And we will first cover the feminine. What is feminine? Well, obviously, the apotheker. When you have a profession like apotheker is a woman. And en at the end can never be. On the other hand, professions at the end are masculine, grammatically speaking. The generic term. Which is very, very weird in German. It only came to my mind last year in a coincidence. It was actually a small boy who was asking me the questions, but wait a second, isn't the girl feminine as well? Jesus, yes, of course, it is feminine, but not in German, not grammatically. Is because it has the diminutive chen at the end. Mädchen means girl. And the same applies for Fräulein, the diminutive of Frau, woman. Fräulein is Miss. Until the 60s, it was also the way how you addressed an unmarried woman, which today obviously is not in use anymore. So the Miss, the unmarried woman, and the girl are neuter. But besides this, women are feminine, grammatically speaking, in German. The numbers are defined as being feminine. So if you speak of a number in the quality of a noun, then you use it in the feminine gender. And here you see sechs I actually wrote as a word, and the rest I wrote as in the numerics. The definition is all the numbers all the way to 12. 0 is usually written as a 0. You write them as the whole word. And 13 to ad infinitum is written as a number. So for the first dozen, you write the word, and then 13 all the way up, you can actually write the number. Now the endings. The endings are actually the most important thing about femininity, because most of the rules which are feminine are related to the ending, and by far the most important one, ung, is so when you see a noun which has ung at the end, then you know it must be feminine. And many of the are from verbs, or the other way around, you can make a verb out of it. For instance, die Spiegelung is reflection, and it could come, or it comes from spiegeln, which is to reflect. Die Ordnung, order. Ordnen is to order. So very, very often you actually have a verb as a base. Also, very often, Ion, coming from Latin, die Nation, die Rebellion, die Assoziation. It's always feminine, and always coming from Latin. Heit und Keit is also something which is always feminine. Die Menschheit is humankind. You wish it, but it can mean both. Or the apartheid, or any other height you want to have. And Keit as well, menschlich, means humanity. So it is a moral thing, the act of, basically, or the desire, cleanliness, everything. I think it is 100%. I don't really could make up any kind of exception, is feminine. Schafft, not so often. beautiful, especially the Mannschaft. Mannschaft means team. Die Herrschaft is the rule, the command of a monarch. Tät, also from Latin, very often the Identität, die Nationalität, die Integrität. All the Täts are feminine, applies for Musik, die Klassik, die Statik. All the X are also feminine. And most of these endings also imply that they are coming from a foreign language, usually Latin as a base. The rules we have covered so far have virtually no exceptions. You remember the girl and the lady are an exception, but there is logic behind it. German logic, I admit. There is not really set. So there are exceptions to it, but you most likely are 80%, which is much better than 33%. If you don't know 3 genders, you guess you have a 33% chance of actually hitting it. In the case of the final E, if you have a noun with a E at many, if not most of them are feminine, but not all of them. For instance, die Lampe, die Blume, die Tasse, die Suppe at the end are feminine. Very well done. With these sets of rules, you actually are already pretty much sure that a lot of the feminine nouns you should be able to master. And in the next 2 lessons, we are going to neuter and welcome back. Willkommen zurück. It's all about masculine. So what is masculine? Arbeiter is a laborer, der Pate is a god, Russe is a Russian. Most national, the masculine people for the men are actually with and der Pole, der Deutsche, der Russe, der Amerikaner. You sometimes have ER, but many nationalities are actually E at the end. And you see here, they're all nouns. And the last is feminine, yes, in 80% of the times, but not when it's to masculine people. The seasons of the year, by definition, there is no rule behind it. They are defined as masculine. Der Winter, der Sommer, der Herbst, und der Frühling, which means spring. There is an exception. There is a second word for spring, which is früh. And this is neuter. Why? Ja, the year is neuter in the German language. The months of the year, from January all the way to December, Januar, der Februar, December, masculine, no rule behind it. They are defined as such. We are lucky. Just them gender, very confusing. Fortunately, they are all the same. And the same applies to all the days of the week. Der Montag, der Dienstag, der Sonntag. The reason being, obviously, is der Tag is masculine. There's even a rule behind it. Mess things up. The only day that have a day at the end is, and there also it remains masculine, fortunately. Even though die Woche, which means week, is feminine in German, but der Mittwoch, couple of many as we have with femininity or neutral gender, but ling is very often encountered. You remember Frühling, the alternative in for saying spring. Der Lehrling is the apprentice. Der Bückling is some sort of fish dish, smoked herring. These are all masculine nouns due to the suffix ling. And the same applies for IG and ICH. IG can be pronounced here either ich or it could be pronounced ich. So IG and ICH could have the same pronunciation. There is no rule. You can say der Honig, but it is totally okay to also say der Honig. And then it is pronounced as if it were written with this ending over here. Then you have der Käfig, der cage. I usually use the ich variation of ing. But you are totally okay to say it as it is written, der Honig, der Käfig, der König, or König, as you wish. And then the actual ending ICH, der Fähnerich is a rather low military rank in German, der Kranich is a crane, or der Aufstrich, spread, very, very delicious, der Aufstrich. And derive from a verb if you have the infinitive and then you simply cut away en. So you cut away the ending, then it is masculine. Any random verb, laufen, to run. If you keep the infinitive and you make a noun out of it, then it is neuter, das Laufen. The concept of running, translation. Aber der Lauf, the ending en, is masculine. It means the race, but a race which, for instance, at Olympic Games, you, and this is called der Lauf. Das Laufen, which is of running. Der Lauf is something. I only know one exception to this rule, and this is das Spiel, which means the game. Das Fußballspiel. It's a game of football or soccer. It should actually be masculine because according to this rule, you have the infinitive, you cut off en, it should be masculine. For whatever reason, it is neuter, das Spiel. But besides this, I actually tried to find another exception when I prepared this. I couldn't find it. Maybe it exists, but usually it is masculine. And nouns with er at the end, which can be personalized. What do I mean with personalizing something? Because I know many students I have, especially when they are younger, when they are 15, 16, I'm telling them this rule, and I ask them, have you understood what I meant with personalization? And they say, yes, yes. And then I give them an example just 2 minutes later. So with personalization, I simply mean that you could use that denomination. For instance, der Wecker. Der Wecker is the alarm. But you could actually call somebody Wecker, who wakes you up. The same applies to Steuer, which is or share. It makes no sense to call a human being this way. But besides Steuer, if he tries to make on the ice. Der Fernseher, which is the nouns which have er at the end, but are not masculine. For instance, das Fenster, which means the window, but window is not something which involves an action. Involve an action, you cannot really make it a human being. So this will apply. Very well done. We have covered femininity, masculinity, Welcome back, my dear. Willkommen zurück, meine Lieben. In this lesson, we are going through one whether you have kind of determining the gender in the German language. Here, I think there are 17 different nouns. Stop the video, have a look at them carefully, and then try to determine which is the grammatical gender of each and any one. All of them could actually be determined by a rule we have gone through in the previous 3 lessons. I am going to switch the slide in a couple of seconds. So if you do not want to see the results, simply pause the video and then come back to me. And I'm going to go through each one of a couple of seconds to tell you why they are actually masculine, feminine, or neutral. So I'm going to change the slide right now. So, die Masse. Die Masse is simply the physical mass which we give with kilograms, grams, and so on. Die Masse is not a 100% rule behind it. It is basically the E at the end. Many, if not most, of the nouns in the German, if they have not all of them. On the other hand, die Umgebung is clearly feminine because it has UNG at the end. Umgebung is the surrounding. Die Mannschaft is feminine as well, simply because it has the suffix Schaft. Mannschaft means team. Actually, the word Mannschaft I like very much because Schaft, if it would have written with F, it would mean to create. So Mannschaft could actually be interpreted logically and derived from the word Mannschaft, that it actually means something which man. Very, very interesting. Die Kommunion. This is what Catholics 9 or 10 years of age, entry into the Catholic community. Kommunion. Many of my classmates actually had it. It is feminine because you have I-O-N at the end, like Nation, Kommunion. Nouns are feminine in German. Die Freiheit. What a beautiful word. Die Freiheit means freedom. It has clearly in. Now the we have der Sperling. Quite familiar how to translate this into English. It has ling at the end, so it must be masculine. You have the Fernseher, and you might actually say, hey, it's a device, so it is something more neutral. It has ER at the end, and you could make a person out of it. Fernseher, if this would be a man, it would be who looks far away. Fern means far, and Seher is somebody who sees. Actually, if you call someone ein Seher, it is a prophet. It is somebody who is capable to look into the future. So the Fernseher thing which could be used to describe a person, and then it is masculine. The September, much easier. It is simply the months of the year and the days of the week. Der Mittwoch are also masculine. In the case of Mittwoch, you have to be a little bit careful because Mittwoch actually means the middle of the week. The reason is Monday historically was Wednesday was actually the 4th one, which is the feminine, aber Mittwoch. This is also why they cut the E, so to avoid misunderstanding. Nebel is masculine. Why? because pretty much everything, with the exception of money, which falls in the sky, is masculine. Das Geld, money, is neutral. Falls is masculine. Der Regen, rain, der Schnee, snow, der Hagel, hail, masculine. It doesn't really fall. It also doesn't go up, so it is masculine. And der Honig, here's again the ending, ig at the end, so it is masculine. And nouns, das Sakrament, here it is the ending, ment, so das Sakrament has to be neutral. Schwarz, it's by definition. All the colors are defined as grammatically neutral. Das Fernsehen, the rule behind it is simply the infinitive, but transformed into a noun. So das Fernsehen, which could be translated as the process of watching TV, is neutral. Trauma is the ending, makes it neutral. Das Trauma, the plural of many nouns which end with a is actually ata. So traumata is the plural, which is the same as in English, just with K. The plural would be comata. Just as a plural is a whole art in create the plural. The Germans are also using the English word gaming, especially for this new gaming culture in our days. It is from the English ing form, and if it comes from the English ing form, it is grammatically neutral. The same as grammatic by English ing. In English is the action when somebody has died. People go there to look at the person one last time. This is public viewing. In German, public viewing, and they use the English term, thus public viewing, is when people are watching. This is of people public. A very, very interesting way how the Germans actually and call it public viewing. Very. Und das Männlein, the diminutive, a small man, a dwarf. If you would use it for a person, it would clearly be an insult. It would at least be pejorative. But you use men often, for instance, in snow. When you have these 7 dwarfs, they can also be referred to as Männlein. It is a diminutive. Its line is neutral. I hope that you were able to solve most of the questions if you want. And these rules about help you in the future to a bit more understanding and also to realize that it is not that difficult, this aspect. Hallo, wie geht's? Hello, how are you? Wie geht's is a very nice way to address someone in friendship in German. We have dealt with, and from now on, we will have a couple of lessons dealing with declension and the cases. Declension is simply the process when you are changing the form of a noun, of an article, and a noun, depending on the case, the gender, and whether it's plural. And we have covered. Now we go to the cases. The standard, but before go deeper into this, a small brief overview as far as cases are concerned. I've already shown you that there is an east-west divide regarding gender in Europe. So the further east you go, the more likely you are that you have 3 genera, and the further west you go, the more likely that you have 2 or even no gender. The same rule also applies for the grammatical cases. The West European languages of Basque and Irish language, but you do not really encounter them day by day. It actually seems that cases make a language that difficult that there seems to be some kind of crowding out, as economists would name it, that the languages without cases kind of win the race. German is among the Romance languages. There's actually just one language which has cases. The further east you go in Europe, the higher the amount of cases. So Turkish, they actually go all the way up to 5, 6, even 7 cases. Russian has 6 or 7. Latin, by the way, language, Latin, and this is also not the record. The record actually is standing almost alone. Hungarian with 18. Finnish is much, much easier. It has just 15 cases. German is actually quite good as far as this is concerned, and this is also the reason why I'm telling you this. We only have 4. The nominative, which is the standard form. The words you look up in a dictionary are in the nominative, and then we have genitive, dative, and accusative. All they are, if you master them somehow, understand the principle. It takes some time, but once you a very unpleasant but very often seen mistakes, and this is why I had to include this aspect in the module with the avoid mistakes. A little hint. Language from outside Europe, then this mostly language. Another reason why I also include here. That is the standard case. You look something up in the dictionary, a noun, a pronoun, an adjective, an article, they are in these. Unless it is noticed in a different way. And when do you have the nominative in a sentence? It's actually quite simple. Of a main clause is in the nominative case, also in the subordinate clause. Sometimes you might actually have some kind of article in which is not, but not the subject, but this is rather the exception. It is not so relevant for you. Important for you to know is the subject of a sentence is nominative. The person or the item in the sentence. It is the which actually gives the action that if you want. This is the subject, and it is in the nominative case. Very intuitive. It is the standard. Actually, it's just left 3 cases, and then it is that menacing at all anymore. I promise you, with a little bit of work and a little bit of repetition, you will aspect. Willkommen zurück. Welcome back. We've covered the nominative. I told you why I consider it important to go through the cases. Let's now start with the easiest of the non-standard cases. It is called accusative. The accusative is quite easy for a very simple reason. It differs only in the masculine form from the nominative. So in the feminine, in the neutral, and in the plural form, even though they are accusative instead of nominative in a certain context, you would not be able to make a mistake there because it does not change their form, morphologically speaking. But in the masculine case, indeed, and it usually, I tell you this right from the beginning, it is linked to the letter N, not M, N, N. The question for the accusative is wen oder was. Wen oder was. It would translate it who or what. But in the English pronoun which actually makes a difference. And wen. Wer for a person, but for somebody who is actually doing an action. And wen and was in this case as well. Here the Germans also asks in the accusative, asks for something happens to. It's basically the object, one of the objects of the sentence. I will give you make clear, but it is essential to understand this difference in order to understand the cases, but especially to understand the accusative. Accusative is usually in a sentence. Nominative, which is the subject, is the director of the show. You can actually perceive it this way. Or it is the chef in a kitchen. And the accusative is the thing which basically is underneath. Actor or just fulfills the will of. Do I like this allegory? Yes, I like it. In a certain way, you can actually try perceive it this way. For instance, here, I see the car. In German, ich sehe das Auto. Ich is the subject because I here is basically running the show. It is the person who sees. And das Auto is accusative. On purpose, I took an example with neuter, so you do not see whether it is accusative or nominative because it is the same form. Das Auto is basically the agent which is seen. It does not have an active part, this sentence. This is all about. So when you use it after certain verbs, for instance, haben, which is by far the most verb, kaufen, to buy, essen, to eat, bezahlen, to pay, others, but haben is most likely the most important one because it is also used verbs in language and after certain prepositions. But here you have four. They go together with the accusative. And then there are 3 or 4. In total are 8 or 9, if I remember correctly. There are a couple of prepositions, 9 in total, which we call in German Wechselpräpositionen. Wechsel means change. Preposition can arbitrarily. So you cannot just throw a coin and then decide, well, it's accusative or it's dative. No, it depends on the context of the action. You can rule a basic rule of thumb. If it is a static action, then it must be dative. If it is a dynamic action, then it is accusative. And I give you an example. My favorite example I give my pupils in order to explain this to them. Ich gehe in die Stadt means I'm going to town. So I'm not yet in town. Stadt here actually could be translated with downtown. So I have to go there. Kind of a transport. It is dynamic. It's accusative. And this is why Stadt is feminine. Ich gehe in. On the other hand, this is a very, very common mistake. When someone says, and many people say, ich gehe in der Stadt. It's static. You immediately understand it when you are native that this must be something static. It would be translated into, I am already in town, walking, but it sounds very, very strange. You would rather say, ich gehe in der Stadt spazieren. Spazieren gehen is actually say, I'm taking a walk around. So, ich gehe in der Stadt involves that static. You are already there. Even go there. This is what core of the action. And then the feminine article in dative is der. So there is not just the masculine article and nominative, it is also, it's a little bit strange, but we will talk about it when we deal with dative as well. So there is indeed a fundamental difference between ich gehe in die Stadt und ich gehe in der Stadt. So what are the most common mistakes if it comes to the accusative? Even many native speakers do it. They simply swap at the end, and I will to understand. The right way to order a coffee in Ich hätte gerne einen Kaffee. I would like to have a coffee. Hätte is some grammatical form, which we're talking about in a different module, which needs accusative. It comes from haben. So, and coffee is masculine, der Kaffee. So you actually have to use this en at the end to make it grammatically correct. Otherwise, it simply does not sound very cultured. Ich hätte gern einen Kaffee. Einen is a indefinite article. Any coffee, not that one of my neighbor's table. And many Germans and beginning would say ein Kaffee. And could also be the subject of the phrase. Ich is also nominative, is the subject of the phrase, but you cannot have two subjects. This is grammatically not possible in German. So, ein Kaffee. Quite wrong, but since Germans do this mistake, it does not make it better. It actually makes it even worse, because it is simply a rather low level of language. And this is why I also have chosen this very, because it is done completely by as well. And by the way, in this sentence, ich hätte gerne einen Kaffee, many foreigners, that's a mistake, no name. They make it feminine. They say, ich hätte gern eine Kaffee. For whatever reason, foreigners think that the standard indefinite article in German is eine. No, it is not. It can be ein, it can be eine, it can be einen, eines, einer, depending on gender, whether it's plural or singular, and depending on the case. Unfortunately, on the other hand, it the whole thing. And it, you can actually be quite proud of yourself that you actually have really accomplished something. And in your journey of accomplishment, as far as is concerned, I wish you help. Welcome back. And zurück. As promised, as announced, we are now dealing with the dative case and later on with the dative is indeed a little bit trickier, but we go step by step, and then with time and patience, everything will be good. For the memory, there are 9 prepositions, which are an, auf, hinter, in, neben, über, unter, vor, zwischen. To be quite honest with you, if I would have actually blindfolded myself, I would not have been able to name all of them. I once managed 7 out of 9. I recommend actively Christmas, it's just actually passively recognize them. These can go with accusative and with dative at the same, not at the same time. They can go with either or. And the rule is if you want, if the transaction or if the dynamic or the whole story is static, then you have the dative case. And if it is dynamic, then it is the accusative. Just for the protocol. We also mentioned this when we talked about the accusative case. One example is den Tisch. Here it is vor dich. The dich is actually very important here. This here is accusative, which means that there is some kind of movement involved. The table has been the sentence. When you say ich gehe vor dir, means I'm walking in front. There is no dynamic there. It's not about to remains the same. I'm simply, since we are both walking, this out of your perspective does not static, and then it is for dir. Dative, and just one example, there are funny mistakes which can be done if you confuse dich and dir, because both could. Do we use the dative case? There is quite an list of prepositions which dative important would be aus, and by far, if you ask me, the most important goes with dative. As you dative comes, it means to give, involve in a certain way a transaction, not necessarily just with something physical, it might also be something emotional, also be something verbal. And here, for instance, means to trust. Vertraue dir, I trust you. Dir is dative. Trust is basically something. Means schenken is to give a gift, to hand over a gift. Verbal answer. The differs from the nominative pretty much everywhere. So there are no identical. To invest a lot of time in by heart. This takes some time. Give yourself 1 or 2 years easily, and don't get frustrated at the beginning. Experience tells me that this is of the German grammar. It is dative and genitive. And so the more patient you are and the more self-understanding you have. I'm saying this because there are some perfectionists who invest a lot of effort and they still struggle in the beginning, because this is just the most normal thing on earth to do. As there's nothing worse than actually sometimes simply need time. Deep into this at all, because we are just at the beginning. You have on the left side the gender, masculine, feminine, neuter. On top, you have the indefinite article, you have the definite article, and you have the form with no article. I'm not going to say it because it is just for you to have a brief idea. It is a lot of learning involved. The only thing which I am mentioning is, because this is almost nice to the and to the genitive. When you have the combination of an article, an adjective, you can see this here, you can see this here with the indefinite article. The middle component, adjective, has an N at the end, actually EN. This is something you can really learn, and once you have make mistakes again about this. And here we also have on the left, you see first, second, third singular, second, third plural. There are actually a couple of third persons here. You also have the possessive pronouns. Possession basically means mine or yours or his and hers and something like this. Just have a look at it for 10 seconds and then do something else. It is just an introductory information, and the rest will come slowly but steadily. One last, it is wrong. D is the article for feminine and the definite. Correct is plural in dative and accusative, because in dative or in genitive, it is der. Just as a brief remark, because this is very often done wrong. And once you have done it wrong, when you read something like Ich bin in der Stadt, you think that Stadt is masculine. No, it's feminine, but you are in the city, so you are not dynamic, it's static, you are there, it's dative. And this is why Ich bin in der Stadt. And to think about that, when you have the order article, adjective, noun, the central segment, as you had it here, has an en at the end. This is quite important because when you have three and you already have one right, you can only kind of make mistakes with the article and indeed with the ending of. The masculine and neutral letter of reference. Again, I show it to you here. Neutral and counter the letter at the end. Important. And then you also have the letter R for feminine, which is more some kind of, you encounter that. And I also say it in advance, even though it will be in the next lesson, the letter S you will find quite often in the context of the genitive. Now, this do not really have a rule, but you have some kind of, when you find some kind of, it might be the cases and it might be a certain case, and this is why I mentioned. Hello, welcome back. It is genitive time. With the good news first. Very good news. You can actually survive genitive. It is not correct German, but it is German. Maybe half of the native speakers. It sounds like a contradiction. It is something which you do not, the southern part of Germany, and almost not at all Austria and Switzerland. So you could always find some sort of dative solution instead of the genitive. Nevertheless, it is a case, it is a used case, and especially if you want to reach a higher level of German and if you want to be perceived as somebody intellectually talented, then it is very important that you also. The rule of thumb is the further you go, or the more cultured you are, the more often you use the genitive when it is prescribed. Because you cannot just dative for genitive. Often people use dative instead of where they examples by the end. So when do we actually use the genitive? The natural genitive, as I like to use it, is then when something belongs to something or somebody. Das Auto meines Vaters. Das Auto obviously is in whose car? Meines Vaters. And so we have see that there is an at the end. You should get used to that. In masculinum and neutral, you very often have this trigger letter S, and then you know it should actually be plurals in plural forms in German. It is just for English words. Usually the plural is formed differently. So when you have some kind of weird S at the end, it is most likely a genitive. Besides this, we use the genitive after certain adjectives or together with certain adjectives, with some verbs, there are not that many, and with some prepositions. And especially in the case of the prepositions, it is so important to actually, if you want to have a certain level of speech. The reason why I mentioned this is closely linked to the way how I grew up. I grew up in the southern part of Germany, close to Stuttgart, where we usually used dative. I had almost no clue. Well, we covered genitive at school, but we simply did not use it all that often. And then when I was 19, I did my A-levels, or Abitur, as we call it in Germany, and I went to Hamburg which is 700 kilometers to the north, where people actually use the genitive. And the people were laughing at me at university because I was speaking like a southerner. Just a small anecdote, so you understand why I actually emphasize this very aspect. So here are some prepositions. It is an almost exhaustive list. I think they are almost all of them. The genitive prepositions very, very often imply some sort of location. Most of them. Nördlich, südlich, östlich, westlich is geographically speaking on the map, basically. There are very, very few exceptions, like trotz, ungeachtet, wegen would also be one. With the location linked prepositions are genitive prepositions. A classic example of a genitive, dative, I don't even call it mistake. It is a mistake grammatically speaking, but since so many people are doing it, democratically speaking, it becomes right. The classic, it is one sentence with which I actually got people laugh at me in a seminar at the University of Hamburg. I used to say, because this is how they say it in southern Germany, wegen dem schlechten Wetter. It means due to the bad weather. But wegen is a genitive preposition, so correct is wegen des schlechten Wetters. If your goal is to be kind of conversant, to have a A2, B1 level, then you can skip the genitive completely. You will not really need it. But if your goal is to study in Germany or to really become a good proficient speaker of this language, then genitive is especially important because you can actually impress native speakers. This is just a remark, a small tip from me. Another mistake which is done so often that it actually is not a mistake. Berlin ist die Hauptstadt von Deutschland. Berlin is the capital of Germany. It is true, it is the capital. But von here is a preposition which requires dative. So Deutschland here, even though you don't see it, is in the dative case. But since genitive implies that something belongs to something, say is Berlin ist die Hauptstadt Deutschlands, then this small s, this is where I also made it in a capital, has to be said. This is a small, but when you do it right, especially then Germans will actually highly appreciate that. And in Austria and Switzerland, pretty much nobody uses anymore. And here, the same as with the dative case, here we only have one table. The table you should not learn by heart as yet. It's just an idea to therapy have to learn certain forms. You see again, component when you have article, adjective, and noun, the middle one has an N at the end, EN. So you already got rid of 33% of the possibilities of making a mistake. Then you have trigger letters. The trigger letter S is for masculine and neuter. You see that somehow always there is an S at the end, and you also have it in the article here, and you also have it here. And the same is true for the R in the feminine gender. So when it is feminine or in plural, you have an R here, R here, and also on the far right of this slide. I don't want to give you more about this as yet, because after all, this module is avoid common mistakes. I just wanted to give you an idea in which direction go if you want to reach a rather high level of proficiency in German. Very well then. I hope that you are doing good. I wish you all the best and welcome back. Let's get right into the action. This time it is about the conjugated verb. We have been covering this in other modules as well. Here, because one of the most common mistakes. The Germans have sort of a fetish with verbs, especially one. There is, in the main clause, there is place, occur. This is the second position. The second position, not necessarily the second. Of course, like to call it the holy. This sentence you have one. If there were 10 commandments, the German language, most likely on the second or third spot, you shall always see the conjugated verb on the second grammatical position in the main clause, but most sentences are actually main clauses. And again, not the second word, the second grammatical position. Because in German, you can start a sentence with pretty much whatever you want to, except the verb. So the first position could be something like time, and the time could be expressed in 4 or 5 words. Sometimes it will simply come afterwards. We simply go through an example. Gehe am Morgen Park. I'm walking Fifi in the park. It's my favorite name for dogs. This is why I chose it. You can also start with the time. Morgen gehe ich mit Fifi den Park. Here, gehe is not the second word, but it's still the second, but just one position. It is the time. Mit Fifi, this is dative object. Gehe ich morgen in den Park. Again, you see, gehe always is on the second spot, irrespectively with what you begin the sentence with. And last but not least, the longest 3 words, the location in den Park. Morgen mit Fifi. Here it is even the 4th grammatical position. Very, very. It's one of the big advantages of the because you have this rule which applies to 100% of the cases. Once you master it, you will never do it wrong again. And this is so much on. Ich gehe am Nachmittag mit Fifi in den Park. Here the mistake is not that you forgot to take Fifi out in the morning, but in the afternoon. No, it is gehen here. This is infinitive. Many native speakers of languages where you do not conjugate verbs are doing this mistake. In German, you have to conjugate the verb, unfortunately. So you should always take care that you actually apply the conjugation. Correct would be ich gehe. This is first person singular of the word gehen. Ich gehe. Which you often find. Tag, ich gehe Fifi. In English, it would be in the afternoon, I go out with Fifi to the park, for instance. So basically, if you try many other languages, then you would have as a result am Nachmittag. Have actually nailed the verb, the conjugation, the second spot. It actually cannot be am Nachmittag is first position. This is ich is the subject of the phrase, and then gehe would be on the third spot. This is an absolute no-go. Correct is am Nachmittag gehe ich, as we have it here. Am Nachmittag gehe ich. Very important not to translate one-on-one from English or many other languages where you have this rigid subject, predicate, object sort of alignment of words called syntax in the language. Another very popular mistake is ich am Nachmittag gehe oder gehen. It's not about conjugating or not conjugating. Ich is the first position, it's a subject, then you must have the verb. You cannot say ich am Nachmittag because this would actually put the conjugated verb at least on the third spot. No way. it also sounds very, very strange, way at least to the native. And again, it is very important to learn so you do not translate one-on-one from another language. Sometimes it might be right. And if you really don't know how to say it, then simply translate it one-on-one. But it is important, especially these very, very, the pillars, basically, the fundamental pillars of the language, that you do not do so. And the earlier you actually start to master these things, the more natural it will become to you. And then after some time, you will actually be able to hear the mistakes in others when they make it. And this will actually give you, when you actually are capable of correcting other learners of the language. And what's more, why else is it important that you put the second verb on the second position to go for a walk with you in the park? Dogs understand much more than we think. Very well. Welcome back. The last lesson dealt with the holy grail of German syntax, the conjugated verb on the second spot. We have a second holy grail, or vice holy grail, and this is that the unconjugated verb particle comes at the end. And I use verb particle. It sounds a little bit strange, but the reason is it is not necessarily a verb which comes at the end. It might actually, even the world-famous Mark Twain, who struggled but in the end managed to learn German, he wrote a long essay in 1880 about the hardships and sometimes also the absurdities in German. So why is it a particle? Because at the end of a sentence, you might have an infinitive. You might have one or two participle forms of any verb, and you from a separable verb by actually necessarily verb, even though the particle is linked infinite to the verb. And of course, many sentences think verb related. And for instance, Peter isst ein Brot. Peter is eating a bread. This is just because you simply do not have a thing. So there you have an infinitive form at the end. But if, in case, the sentence has something coming from a verb and it is not conjugated, it is a fixed form, you will find it at the end. This is basically how it is said correctly. So here we have a couple of examples in what circumstances you might actually think unconjugated coming from a verb at the end. Modal verbs, they're very important. They appear very often, können, sollen, müssen, and so on. They are called modal verbs. The rule is the modal verb gets conjugated. Where does it stand? On the second spot. And then in the end, the main verb of the sentence verb, heute einen Kaffee in der Stadt, to drink, is the main verb. It's not. You find it at the modal verb, in this case, möchten. Well, it's third person plural, so it looks like an infinitive, but it is conjugated on the second. The Germans have a weakness for making brackets, two segments, two particles of the verb. Pretty much everything, with the exception of the first position, comes in between, no matter how long, how absurdly long a sentence can be. And when you read literature, especially scientific literature, sentences can be very, very long. Scientists like to do that. It is most likely compensatory for the emptiness of their findings. They simply pronounce it so elaborately, so one thinks, hey, this must be a smart guy. Future one. German future tenses, we only use one. The other one is not really used anymore. Future is a very simple, in my opinion, the easiest tense in German because you only have to conjugate one auxiliary verb, which is werden. Ich werde im Februar Tennis spielen lernen. I will learn to play tennis in one is defined by auxiliary verb conjugated, where second spot, right, and at the end you have the infinitive of the verb you actually are going to do. Here you see you have spielen and lernen. You have here spielen and lernen. So why is it spielen lernen und nicht lernen spielen? The reason is the verb which comes at the end is the one which you will be doing, and you will learn. You will not play, at least in this very sentence. Speaking, it has to be spielen lernen. You can have a one. Here, indeed, you can. So, not one, which the gerund in English, sometimes it might even be progressive form, but not always. It can be at the end, but it is not confined to stay. Or participle one is just a semi-rule in the context. Urgent. Dringend here is used as an adjective. Dringend, urgent, you have it at the end. As ein Buch lesen, which basically means I beat you in tennis while I'm reading a book. That's a very sentence to say, but maybe it is true, maybe not. Nevertheless, here at the end, you have indeed a participle one. It is a gerund which implies that something is taking place while something else happens, or the other way around. Or participle one can, or Partizip 1, as we say in German, can also be used adverbial. Adverbs determine or describe verbs. Adjectives describe nouns. Ich schlage dich spielend beim Tennis. Spielend here simply means that I beat you in tennis as if it were just a game. So it's very, very easy. Jemanden spielend schlagen is basically, we don't really have a fight. It is so easy to beat you that I beat you spielen. And here you see, if it is adverbial, it is linked to the verb, and then it is not necessarily at the end of the sentence, but it can be at the end of the sentence. That's the only difference as far as Partizip 1 is concerned. On the other hand, Partizip, which very often has ge, so front as is usually on the last spot of the sentence. You have it in the perfect tense and in the so-called plusquam tense. It's basically present perfect and past perfect in English. In German, it is not important. It is, you have strict rules. Past tense you use in German, you can choose both. Even though plusquamperfekt indeed implies that something in the past has happened before something else has happened, which is also in the past out of the perspective of the speaker or writer. Perfect. Wir haben die Hausaufgaben nicht gemacht. You see the bracket haben gemacht, very, very common source of mistake. Usually people say, wir haben gemacht die Hausaufgaben nicht. Or wir haben nicht gemacht die Hausaufgaben. No, you have a participle too. It is a particle conjugated, linked to a verb. So the end. Wir haben die Hausaufgaben. Perfect is the same sentence, just the auxiliary in the present. It is pretty much as you have it in English. I have played, I had played. Rule of the bracket between the two verbs, you are perfectly good. A little bit more confusing are separable verbs. Separable verbs are verbs which have a prefix, which is a syllable. And if the syllable is a word in itself, then when you conjugate it, it detaches and travels all the way to the end of the sentence. It's very confusing at the beginning. To it. Einkaufen means to do the shopping. Kaufen just means to buy something. Einkaufen is, it also changes a little bit the connotation. Sometimes these prefixes completely change the meaning of the verb. Learn all one. Ich kaufe jeden Donnerstag im Supermarkt ein. It is not ich einkaufe. Ich kaufe, so the particle can get conjugated to the sentence. It can be infinitesimally, and you have this small particle. Ein is very is the meaning. In German, you have to read all the way to the end of a sentence in order to understand what this all is about. And this makes it quite, when you have long sentences, you have to concentrate much more. And when you produce long sentences, you must have finished the whole story before you actually started to speak firsthand. When you write, it is not so tricky because you always can self-correct yourself, or you can simply delete and write it anew. But when you speak, German requires a much higher level of concentration if you want to speak it right. Means to watch. Sehen means to see, and zusehen means to watch. Also a difference. Raphael sieht Roger beim Siegen zu. Raphael watches Roger winning. Detached, so it comes all the way to the end of the sentence. It's not Raphael zusehen. It will take some time until you will get used to this. Maybe that most likely. But once you have certain advantages, because it gives you a certain flexibility with words, there are certain kind of contexts where you can indeed do that. So as soon as you are at B2 or maybe even a C1 speaker of German, then you will start also profiting. At the beginning, this is uneasy, but nevertheless, with a little bit of patience, you are going to master that as well. Willkommen zurück. Welcome back, my dear friends. Now, in this lesson, we are going to go over very common mistakes referring to not right particle at the end of the sentence. By far, the most common mistake is in the past tense, in the perfect tense, because plusquamperfect is not used so often that you simply do not put the participle where it belongs. Where does it belong? At the very end. Habe gemacht den Fernseher. No. Gemacht actually has to be. It means I broke the TV set. Also, there is a very creative variant where you don't even use a auxiliary verb, and then it is ich gemacht kaputt den Fernseher. Sounds very funny, but it is done quite extensively, especially at the very, very beginning of the A1. If you should be at an A1 level, then this lesson indeed is particularly important, because here, from the very beginning, you start to do it right, then you will never do it wrong again. Correct is ich habe, then comes the filling of the sentence. In this case, den Fernseher kaputt, and then at the end, hier gemacht. And then we know what this sentence actually is about. Because if this sentence is really, really long, and you have not broken the TV set, but you have bought the TV set, you will actually learn this cheerful news only once you have listened to the last word. Then it would not be gemacht, but gekauft. So you see how important it is to actually listen all the way to the end when you deal with German. It also applies this sort of mistake with the infinitive, which also comes at the end, as we know. Wird morgen essen eine Pizza. He will be eating a pizza tomorrow. That's good for him, but it is not right grammatically. Wird essen morgen eine Pizza. Both of them you can hear quite extensively. Correct is the verb bracket. Wird morgen eine Pizza essen. The tense we have here is future. Futur 1. Werden, auxiliary verb, conjugated, second spot, you have it here, and then all the way at the end, you have the infinitive. That's actually not that difficult. You only have to get used to it. This is why we repeat it over and over again. Very popular is separable verbs not getting separated when conjugated. So the prefix is not separated at all. Max absagt den Termin. Absagt den Termin is a word. So we know that it is a separable word. So we have to detach it and put it all the way at the back. The variant 2 of the mistake is, yes, you separate it, but it does not travel all the way to the end. Max sagt ab den Termin bei der Bank. This here sounds better, but is not correct. Correct is, Max sagt den Termin bei der Bank ab. And again, if the sentence is longer, let's assume that you also want to meet of up, you would have to, actually means to accept the appointment. So time at a given location, you are going to listen or read all the way to the end in order to have a clue what Max actually doing. And beware, there are actually prefixes which you do not separate. Which ones? The ones which are no verbs in and by, words in and by. In German, it does not mean a young or unmarried woman. An example, Peter bekommt sein Gehalt. Peter gets his salary. Ursula entkommt der Polizei. Das Auto verkommt zum Schrott. The car is rendered useless. It's correct not to detach because these verbs are not detachable. Very well done. I hope that this lesson has helped you a little bit to bring clarity into the fog of the German verb bracket. And I hope that you are still enjoying German. Hello again. In this lesson, we are going to talk a little bit about prepositions in the context of time, daytime, weekdays, months, and so. Fortunately, it differs a little bit from English. The question, what time is it? Wie spät ist es? Or wie viel Uhr ist es? Uhr is this one. This one is a Uhr, it's a clock. But the question, wie spät ist es, also tells us a lot about the psychology of the Germans. Spät means late. The Germans are actually asking you, how late is it? Because they always have to run to do something. And indeed, this is true. It is very difficult to actually get a German to have a beer with because they are always. Answer, es ist, and then the time, for instance, 12 Uhr takes place at 12 o'clock, then 12 Uhr. When you want to say that something takes place in the morning or in the afternoon, you use am, English am. The preposition am. Am Morgen means in the morning. Am Mittag means at midday, lunchtime. Am Abend is in the evening. But you have a small exception. It is in der Nacht, because it is die Nacht, and they are not using an here as a preposition for whatever reason. At night is in der Nacht, and Mitternacht. Mitternacht means midnight, so 12 o'clock or 0 o'clock, 24 o'clock. When you have these, Morgen, Vormittag, Mittag, Nachmittag, Abend, Nacht, and you add an S, then it is written with a small letter and it becomes an adverb. It means that you regularly do something at that time. Zum Beispiel, morgens esse ich gerne Müsli. This does not mean that I'm eating muesli in the morning tomorrow. It means that every morning I like to eat some muesli. Nachts schlafe ich sehr gut. I sleep very well at night. This does not mean tonight or yesterday. It means in general, in the concept of what we call night, I tend to sleep very well. When you have a date, Weihnachten. The answer in the case of Weihnachten, Christmas, would be am 25. Dezember, because the date, the preposition of an and an article, which in this case is dative. This is why it is am. And the ordinal numbers are actually not that difficult to make in German. One is ersten, December, 1st of December. Two, am zweiten, three, am dritten, but we have rules. All the way, it is the number 10, ten. For instance, all the way to ad infinitum, but in the case of months, all the way to 31st, it is number plus sten. We simply add an S. Am 20. Ist. Now, at the weekdays are masculine also, so we are also working with am. So this M, masculinity, Montag, am Mittwoch, so on. And when you want to express that something takes place from to, for instance, von Montag bis Freitag, this means from to Friday. And also with the week, you have this possibility of adding an S, and then it becomes an adverb. So it's not a noun anymore. You write it with a small letter, and it means that you do something every Monday. For instance, ich mit meinem Freund. On Mondays, I play tennis with my friend. A very common mistake is when we express the years. Here we do not use a preposition. So you would say in English, in 1990, Germany reunited, which it did indeed on the 3rd of October. It's on a day until now. In German, you would say the 19 wiedervereinigt. You simply use a preposition here. You just name the number of the year. And years in German are not expressed 1900, etc. All the way to 1999, we do it as we do it in English as well. We first say the amount of hundreds and then the rest. So 1555 would be 1555. You usually use the word 100, which means 100, but you could also say 1555 whatsoever. So the pronunciation of would be 1871. I chose that very year because the first unification of the German countries and principalities took place in 1871. This is why when we talk about the events of 1990, when East and West Germany merged together, they did not unify. They reunited because a united for that as well. That this lesson could help you a little through the jungle of prepositions. I hope that you are still enjoying learning German. Wie spät ist es? Wie viel Uhr ist es? A very important aspect in everyday, day-to-day life in any society, but especially in a society which is so much fixed on punctuality, on precision. It is how to, and also how to ask for it. The general question is this: wie spät? How can you answer? This is much more. If it were midday, 12 o'clock, then you 12 Uhr. And if it is really on the minute, then you can say es ist Punkt 12 Uhr. Quarter past. Then you tell nach 12, it's quarter past. You can always the hour and then the number of the word Minuten at the end, you do not necessarily have. So you can actually say Uhr und 15. Or es ist 12 Uhr. When you use und. Otherwise, you simply say the shortest one would be es ist 12 Uhr 15. If it is 12:30, and you also have it in French, et demi, you would have, then it's 12:30. The Germans also have something like this. We will see this on the next slide. But you can simply say es ist 12:30 Uhr. Simply say es ist 12:30 Uhr. For instance, on an airport or in some kind of travel environment, obviously you would never hear constructions like half past. It would always give you the accurate amount of minutes, even if 30 minutes past. Vor 1 to 1, as you have, or 12:40 or 12 Minuten. All is okay. But we additional things can say it, but before we, how do you actually express the time? It's um. 12 Uhr means at 12 o'clock. 12 bis 12 Uhr, 10 Uhr, you say from, to, von, bis, and seit 12 Uhr, 12 o'clock. But it still takes place because this is actually the indication of night. But typical have half past. You also have a construction in German, but it is actually not half past. The Germans here are very optimistic. They look into the future. They say halb 12:30 actually is 12:30. So we already kind of have lived half the time to the full time, to the next clock, to the next hour. So 12:30, they look into the future. Not, you cannot say es ist 11:30, 12:30. No, you look into the future. And the same is true with quarter past, where you can say es ist 15:15. So you talk to any, but here in this 12 o'clock, and you go a quarter of the way to 1 o'clock. There is a certain logic behind it. So it is a quarter towards 1 o'clock. This is what it actually implies. Viertel eins. But now comes the absolute hammer. It is not used in the northern part of Germany, but the southerners are crazy about it. 12:45 is, es ist 3/4. It is 3/4 all the way from 12 to 1 o'clock. So you can really see the Germans here are actually quite optimistic. This is something I like very, very much. And these small aspects, you can actually learn quite a lot of how the psychology of a German are really punctual. Not as much as the Swiss or the Chinese. Two cultures was planet ability as far as time is concerned. This is why the Japanese had the first real high-speed train in the world. Accuracy. And not just that. But in Germany, punctuality is important, and they actually take notice of that. So if you are late, even if it is just, oh my God, 3 minutes, they might actually, if they are really, really strict about it, even if it is a casual meeting, they might actually draw your attention. And then they will say, hey, I've been waiting for you for 3 minutes. And then they look at you and you feel so badly. You just want to run away and drink alone. So yes, indeed, time is very important in the psychology Germans. So it's right. Very well done. On time. Welcome back. Now we are going to travel all around the globe. It is about the names of the countries and, yes, their gender. How could it be different? How do you ask for these prepositions? Where from is woher kommst du? Where kommst du? Komme aus Österreich, aus Wien. So aus is that you are coming from. Where you are, wo bist du? Ich bin in Bucharest, its capital, so a city. And where are you going to? Implying the direction is wohin gehst du? And the answer is ich gehe nach Indien or nach Delhi, or Delhi, as we would pronounce it in German. Ich gehe nach Indien, nach Delhi. It is quite important to know these prepositions and not to confuse them within each other, but also the same situations, but with people, with friends, or with institutions, we use different prepositions, and they are very often confused as well. Countries, German language, have a gender, and so they are Declension. This is a little bit, fortunately, there are that many rules why a country suddenly is masculine and not feminine. Many countries have the suffix Land, like Deutschland, Neuseeland, Russland. Poland, not really, but actually yes, because you actually could also say Poland, but no, this is just, it's almost that suffix. Anyway, many countries have it, and because it is das Land, the country, Land means country, so all the country names, England, for instance, England, which have an Land in the end, are neutral. Then all the countries which have IEN at the end, Bosnian, Argentinian, Spanien, Italian, and so on. Usually the countries which have IA in English, they are also neutral, but many other countries as well are neutral. When you have a neutral country, we do not, as by default, we do not use, with the exception, so you don't have to make the declension, specifically set the determinate article, like for 17. Jahrhundert, the Poland of the 17th century. You would set an article, but usually do not use this. No declension. 30, 40, 50, it's clear plural. In the case, there is no rule. Our research to find out whether I could find a rule. No, there is no reason why die Schweiz, which is Switzerland, Ukraine, Mongolei, Dominikanische Republik, at least Dominikanische Republik, feminine, because it is the Republik, because you have at with the Demokratische Republik Congo, the former Zaire, Elfenbeinküste. Die Küste, you have an E at the end, could be feminine. Here indeed it is, means coast. But Slovakia or Mongolei or Schweiz, there is no rule. They are feminine. We also, and when you are using in that context, ich bin in der Schweiz, you are there. And feminine is there. Sounds very strange. Ich fahre in die Ukraine. Klar, fahren is dynamic, so it's accusative, so it becomes die. Ich fahre in die Ukraine, but ich bin in der Ukraine. Und ich komme aus der Mongolei. Here you also have dative, because aus always requires dative. The masculine countries, also no rule. There is kind of a geographical limitation. Many countries in the Middle East, Iran, Yemen, Oman, Lebanon, they are masculine, and countries like Chad, like Niger, oder Congo here, Brazzaville, and Kinshasa is the capital. Republic of the Congo. Countries, fortunately, again, are intuitive because there is something plural with them. Netherlands, it's the countries which are below sea level or quite low. You also have this in English with Netherlands. Die Seychellen is a group of islands, Färöer, Philippinen, also USA, because it is die Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika. In German, they also talk about states and not about just one state. The UAE, by the way, as well, VAE, abbreviated here, die Vereinigten Arabischen Emirate, the United Arabian Emirates. How do you use it with a preposition? In den, it's dative because you are there, it's static, and then den is the plural article for USA. Ich bin auf den Philippinen, the same thing. Ich fliege in die Niederlande. In die, because it is accusative, but if it is an island, you actually say, ich fliege auf die Seychellen, not in die. So if it is an island, on, auf them, and not in them. It is just a small thing. Ich komme aus den Vereinigten Arabischen Emiraten. Ich komme von den. So there are also islands, and then you use von den Antillen and not aus. This is just a small thing to take notice of. This, but it is indeed a source of quite common mistakes, and I hope that this lesson could help you avoid most of them. Well, the last lesson Hi, wie geht es Ihnen? Wie geht es dir? Both mean the same thing in German. Ihnen is third person plural. It is the polite form, specifically respectful form. Und wie geht es dir is second person singular. It is simply you. So which one shall you use? This is what this lesson is about. It is a personal lesson to me because I grew up in the southern part of Germany. My parents were also rather conservative. And then I went to Hamburg to study, which was an open, liberal city, a big city, many, many migrants there, a lot of English spoken there, where Sie was not really used at all whatsoever. So in the South, I would rather say Sie is much more often used. And yeah, but the general rule basically is that the formal setting, you should use Sie, and in a rather informal, casual setting, a du is totally okay. The further south you go, the more Sie you have. The younger generation, or the younger the generation gets, the less Sie you get. In cities like Cologne and Berlin, they are very, very, kind of, the people are quite close to each other there, and you have a huge working class. In the working class, it is quite common to actually use du in German. So in Berlin, in Cologne, also in Hamburg, even though Hamburg is a little bit more conservative in comparison to them, there is almost no Sie outside a strictly professional environment. The rural areas in the south, especially around Stuttgart and München, let alone Switzerland and Austria, they are extraordinary Sie-ish. So there you should stay safe, and you can actually safely Sie everyone who is older than 20, 25 without any problem of making a social mistake. And even if they don't like it, they will simply say, call me du, and then you have absolutely no problem. I personally have a very strong inhibition of using du, or the verb in German used for it is duzen, anyone who is older than 40 years of age. There I would always go, no matter where I am, with the Sie, and then quite quickly we negotiate which one is better. In a professional environment, I would always start with Sie, even if the guy is 20 years old. The first time you meet, Sie is an absolute mandatory must. Maybe not necessarily if you are an informatician. So there are a couple of branches where Sie is not really used. But as soon as you are in an environment where there is a suit and a tie, no way with du, at least not at the first meeting. Usually it is said that the older person offers the du, and then the younger one usually accepts. There is no choice. And then suddenly you can actually say du to someone, even though this is very, very difficult. If you have been used to sitzen someone and then suddenly you have to switch to du, this is very, very difficult. At least it used to be for me. There was a drastic change ever since around the year 2000, which was the advent of the internet. The internet has lowered, generally speaking, the language level. English has penetrated society. English does not have anymore, at least, does not have this polite, extra polite way to address someone. And in general, showing respect towards someone else has lost significance in the last 2 decades. And of course, the more people stay in front of the computer, the less time they actually can exercise their social skills. Nevertheless, with strangers, I would simply start with Sie, especially as a foreigner. Why? It simply shows that you want to integrate yourself, that you actually show respect, and this will inevitably have as a consequence that people will also respect you more. Very well then. This was a very short one. Nevertheless, I consider it a very important one because you only have to win when you do it polite. All the best. Hopefully seeing you well in the next lesson. Bye-bye. Hello again for the last time in this module. The last lesson was about funny mistakes. And this one, which is the last lesson of this module, is not really funny, but I still consider it quite important because mistakes can also happen on the social level. All in all, Germany is a rather easygoing society. So no matter from where in the world you are coming, the Germans, and they are tolerant. Nevertheless, there are a couple of soft spots, not many, but they are a little bit more active. And it has a lot to do with what has happened in Europe and especially in Germany during the 20th century. To talk about the Second World War is not taboo per se. We can actually talk quite openly and tricky if the Germans in positive light have heard rightly. In Germany, it is not good to put them in a positive light. You can criticize them as much as you want. They would happily agree because for 3/4 used to self-criticize for the obvious reason. If you are unsure how the attitude of your conversation partner or partners is, simply for the beginning avoid, especially 1933, and it was basically the time when Adolf Hitler marched in. And there is a substantial amount of people who are actually quite cultured and be read. Germans love to read books, and then any historical subject whatsoever. Not just in Germany, you also have it. There was a very strong movement in the 20th century, and it is still running. So, if you are coming from a society which knows a clear division between the masculine and the feminine hemisphere, especially if it is a society where there are just these two hemispheres and there is no other aspect involved, until you know, especially in the big cities, especially in Berlin, in Hamburg, and Cologne, avoid these topics. And here we also have gestures. And these I actually did, and I was not really praised for them. I did not want to insult anybody. So in some people, especially when they are younger, because they are not really used to this anymore, if you help a woman to put on her coat, and in actually a lady I was living together with in a shared flat, and we played some pool, and by the end I was trying to put me. It was simply a friendly gesture, as I knew from my parents. She immediately left her coat and said, I can do this by myself. And I then that I was not even thinking that she might not be capable of doing this. I wanted to be polite. Well, since I've lived through that in the big cities, try the waters will be good, because I'm sure there are also many German women who would actually appreciate if you would be helping them into their coats. The same is true for other similar gestures, like opening up the door of the car or lighting a cigarette, things like this. I once had an encounter with a female professor, and the door, and I simply go, and then it was visible that she was a little bit uneasy. If you come from more conservative cultures, here indeed you have a little bit of reason to be careful. School and media propaganda has been quite strong. This topic, and the young generation is quite, they are not used to actually be treated this way. So we have to be a little bit more careful. The way how we address people in German, I think I mentioned this before in this module, Frau Schneider, Herr Frank. Herr actually is gentleman, Frau is just. So also the way how they address is actually quite chauvinistic. that this has never changed, but there is here discrimination between Frau and Herr in the German language. What is an absolute no-go, on the other hand, is to maybe be able to do this in Switzerland, but surely not in Germany. Fräulein is Miss, and all the way to the 60s, it was quite common. You should be very well done. Common mistakes. We have gone through quite a few aspects. Obviously, it is never possible every to kind of you can have a is concerned to gather a couple of aspects which I think that it's a little bit faster than reality into living in Germany. Maybe you are already there, and then maybe you have found it helpful what I tried to give you as information. I also hope that you liked it, and wherever you are in the world, I wish you all the best. And if you're still to come,